All right. Hey, Dr. Kyle. How are you?
I am doing well as I was sharing, recovering from the end stages of a cold after lots of traveling for speaking, but doing well and excited to be here with you.
Oh, I'm so happy to be here with you, especially as you're recovering. And yeah, thank you so much. So it seems like we've got a lot of people viewing from your audience, from my audience. So I thought we could take a minute to just introduce ourselves before we dive in. So I'd love to hear a little bit more. I mean, I know about you and I think you're absolutely fabulous, but I'd love to hear you introduce yourself.
Yes, my name's Kyle Elliot. My pronouns are he, him, his. I'm a tech career coach, so I primarily work with senior managers and executives in tech in two buckets. One group is people figuring out, what do I want to do for a living? Maybe I have 10, 15, 20 years of experience. I don't know like what I'm doing. What do I do with that? And another group is, okay, I know what I want to be doing. How do I go land that job? And oftentimes, confidence, communication, those sorts of things get in the way when they're navigating that. And I help them move through that.
Perfect. Well, that is everything that we're going to be talking about today, which is really exciting. And for those of you that don't know me, I'm Hannah Kissel. So I am a life coach and I work with high performing executives. So Kyle and I have a similar audience. I work more on the internal. So let's say you're suffering from people pleasing, imposter syndrome, self doubt. Also, I do a lot of burnout prevention as well as a lot of harsh inner critic work, anger, procrastination, really intense emotions. And I get people more toward confidence, more toward empowerment, more toward feeling in their what I call their self energy. And I work across all industries, but I used to work at LinkedIn for 7 years. So I predominantly started my career in tech. So we've got quite a bit of crossover here. Um, so let's just dive right in because I loved with what you're saying about, those two types of people that you help. And I would say in my coaching practice, what I see, I predominantly work with high performers, as I know you do as well. And when people come to me and they're lost in their career, I really see two types. This is what I call the seeking high performer. And one of them is, let's say they work in tech and they know that they want to be doing something different. They know they want to be doing something that's a bit more aligned with their values, typically their values of health, service, and freedom. They want to be helping people. Like I've had a client that really wants to be a meditation teacher, or another client that wants to go into
Mhm.
coaching. But they're really kind of afraid of financial insecurity. So that's bucket one. And then there's bucket two, which is, let's say clients that have had 10, 20-year careers, they're potentially an
Mhm.
executive, and they're just like, I have no fucking idea what I want to do, but
Yeah.
it's not this. Like,
Yeah.
I know I don't want to stay in this type of role, but I have been in it for so long. I'm quite well compensated. I'm quite good at it. And I'm really just not sure where to go from here.
Yeah.
So I would love your take on really how you would approach both. I think maybe the second bucket would be a little bit more of your bread and butter. But
Yeah.
how would you approach that?
And then I think maybe we can go into bucket one because maybe bucket two might end up in bucket one. Oftentimes, when people work with me, they're like, oh, now I know what I want to do. Now we can start the real work, which I think all of it's the real work. But when people don't know what they want to do, I think it's an amazing time to reflect on your values. I think you've talked a lot about this and saying what's really important to you. And oftentimes, the first place people will start looking during a job search is job boards. Let me look on Indeed, Monster, LinkedIn. I think that can be helpful, but I would encourage people to take a step back and figure out what's your North Star, what's guiding you. And in a very first session with people, often say, let's look at your life goals, your long term goals, and pause. And very rarely are the people I'm working with, even when they're really big executives, entrepreneurs, founders, they're like, I don't have any life goals. I don't have any long term goals or values. And I'm often surprised because they're running multi-million, multi-billion dollar companies. So that's a really good place to start if you're feeling stuck, spending a handful of just even minutes writing down your goals, your values, your dreams. Because then you can say, okay, what jobs move me toward that? Maybe a value of mine is having some balance. Maybe a value of mine is health. Maybe a value of mine for a lot of my clients is financial independence. So what jobs are going to move me toward or away that it's kind of like the game hot or cold. You can be like, oh, hot, 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 that's moving me toward that, or cold, it's moving me away from that. So starting at that big picture can be really helpful. And then once you have that, you can get a little more granular. I like moving into a few different quadrants, saying, okay, what do I absolutely need in my next job? Let's get really specific around salary, title, remote, in person. What do I want? What are my preferences? And then what do I not want? What are those deal breakers? But you can only do those once you know the long term, what's important to you.
Yeah. It's one of my coaches, who I trained with, Martha Beck. I think that we've spoke about her.
Yes.
Yeah, she says that when people are lost, what she's trying to anchor them to, and sometimes what I try with my clients is what feels more joyous. So if you feel in your like we're always trying to move toward joy. So if you look at that and your body completely recoils from a job, okay, we know that that's not what you want. But if you look at that and you think, okay, this is starting to feel warmer, this is feeling good in my body, this feels
Mhm.
like it's moving toward joy. I think that, yeah, the values exploration, and I do that a lot with my clients, especially those who are lost, because sometimes it's like they can't even consider what a life looks like outside of finance or what a
Mhm.
life looks like outside of tech. And they're kind of meandering and they're choosing, okay, how do I even look at that? So I love anchoring into that as a place to start. And then I'm curious, like, what would you say about, the kind of the first bucket of the high performer who, I get this a lot. Like, I'm in, especially because I've done this. Like, I'm working at a tech company, I'm working at Microsoft, or I'm working at Google, or I'm working at Amazon, even LinkedIn, and I I want to become a coach, or I want to
Mhm.
become a meditation teacher, but I'm so well compensated. And how do I make the leap? And I'm wondering, I mean, I definitely know my take on this, but I'm wondering what your take on this is, because it comes up a lot.
It's scary. There's those golden handcuffs. Before I left to do coaching full time, I worked at a university. I had my housing paid for. I had a meal plan. I had health care. I had retirement. I had a good salary. It's scary to leave all that for uncertainty, and that change is really scary. A lot of my clients are very data driven. So I love doing some modeling. Can we model out what's the worst case scenario? What's that look like? Okay, what's the best case scenario? Let's look at that. And then what's most likely? And actually following that, a lot of clients say, okay, what if I don't get any clients in the first 30, 60, 90 days? Okay, great. Let's keep following that. What would that actually look like? And us spending 20, 30 minutes, an hour on that and actually mapping that out can be really helpful. The same with your job search, but we're talking about entrepreneurship now and really mapping that out. Okay, what would that look like? I did that for myself. Okay, let's say I get no clients for a year. What does that look like? And I'm resourced, so I realized I have a certain level of privilege. But okay, I max out these credit cards. Okay, have to go back and be a server from back in my days. I worked at Denny's in high school. Like, what are all the options I have to do? And that can be really powerful. Do you realize the worst case scenario is maybe I go back and work at LinkedIn for you? Maybe that's the very worst case scenario. And then they're like, oh, the worst case scenario is I'm back exactly where I started. And I went and pursued that and I don't feel regret.
Yeah, I actually dreamed last night that I was back managing a team at LinkedIn. And then at the end of the dream, I murdered someone. So that was like very weird. So I was like,
Maybe a
okay.
sign that it's not right and you made the right choice.
It was like, okay, maybe this isn't the vibe. Um, yeah, I mean, I would definitely say, because sometimes as well, especially in coaching, when people are career transitioning and they want to be in
Mhm.
coaching, a lot of these companies, if you work in tech, they'll give you an educational stipend.
Yeah.
So something that I look at as well is, okay, let's say, how can you even start to retrain while you're still in corporate?
Mhm.
Is this something that your business will
Mm.
pay for? Will they pay for a coaching certification? And I mean, I know for myself as well, like, I did a financial model with my financial advisor, and it was like, okay, right at that time, I was also considering going for a master's in creative writing, which I ended up doing. But he was just like, "You are choosing the worst financial
Yep.
path." And I was like, "Yes, Marcus, I am. But you know what? I'm doing it because I believe in myself." And it was
And
it. Go ahead.
oh no, I was just gonna say I love that. And looking at all those different options too and saying, here's these different options can be really empowering as well.
Yeah, totally. And I knew that for me, I really wanted to leave LinkedIn. I wanted to go back to school for creative
Mhm.
writing, and I wanted to start my own coaching practice. And that to
Mhm.
me, I think I really had kind of unshakable confidence that it would work out, which we're going to get to in a minute. But I think as well, it for people that are leaving, it's what I mean, I don't really see this often, especially with those people that work in tech or work in finance. And one of my clients, I just did a LinkedIn live with her. I mean, we spoke about this for months and months, and now she was the head of investor relations for APA Group. Now she's taking a 5-month trip around the world, but it was, she's very financially driven, like she's the head of IR. So it was modeling. It was choosing, okay, worst case scenario, but also looking at the trade-off of what would my life look like if I stayed?
Hmm.
What does that look like in 2, 3 years, 5 years? And a lot of
Hmm.
people feel like almost like, okay, this is actually a bit of a soul death for me if I'm doing this, but I know that something out here happens. But that's not to say I never advise people just quit your job and see what happens. It's like, okay, can you retrain? Do you have a financial runway? What does that look like? How long is that runway? What if you get no clients for a year? Can you sustain? How much is your training going to cost? And it's like very specific, not like, okay, let's just throw the head in the sand, you know.
Yeah. And I love that looking at the values too. What are your values? What's important to you? Because then saying, oh, does this staying at this company align with my values? Does leaving right away align with my values? And you mentioned the company perks around additional training. Something too is a lot of companies, once you've been there a while, they'll provide you a sabbatical. Sometimes it's paid, sometimes it's unpaid. But looking at those different options and realizing it's often not just A or B, either I stay or leave, but is it maybe I leave and my current company is my first client, and maybe I'm going to leave and they're going to be my first client and I'm going to consult for them. So really realizing there's a lot of options out there, and modeling can be really powerful, weighing those benefits and costs.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. I mean, I was kind of quite surprised because I sold a lot of products to the recruitment industry. So I thought that that was going to be my client base. But mainly, initially, when I started, it was all people that worked at LinkedIn. And that was my biggest, those were my biggest clients. Um, I want to switch a little gears a little bit and talk about, a bit about imposter syndrome
Mhm.
and with people who feel lost, let's say, especially in tech right now with the redundancies going
Mhm.
on, and or even people, the job opportunities are kind of smaller as this industry is going through just a huge shift.
Mhm.
And so I'm wondering, like, how do you approach redundancies and really in that category of, I know what I want to do. Let's say I know I want to be a COO, or I know I want to be a director or even a sales manager, but I keep getting knocked back from jobs and I've been made redundant, or I'm just not getting the jobs that I want. I'm pretty stagnant and I really
Mhm.
want to move forward. And I'm starting to feel like I'm not good enough. Maybe the problem's me. Maybe this is never going to happen for me. And I'd love to hear some tactics on how you approach that.
One of the biggest challenges I find with job seekers, that's not their fault, but what happens a lot is people tend to take it personal. They're applying for a job and they're like, oh, this person rejected me. No, they didn't reject you. They rejected the application, maybe. And oftentimes there's other reasons you're getting rejected. It could be they already filled the role, decided to pause it, all of that. You have to remember there's hundreds, if not thousands, of people applying for each role, and there's one opening, if that. Sometimes the opening isn't even there because they already filled it, all these reasons. So developing that grit is really important, and not tying your worth to, hey, my worth is if I get this job offer, but instead saying, okay, what's in my control in this job search? When I work with clients, I like setting KPIs, key performance indicators. A lot of my clients are data driven. So instead saying, we're not going to measure on the number of interviews we get. Instead, what's in our control is it? I'm going to work on internalizing my accomplishments, which is one way to combat imposter syndrome. Is that I'm going to build a supportive community around me of people who I can turn to. Another way to combat imposter syndrome backed by research. So saying, what are the ways I'm going to navigate imposter syndrome that are in my control? I can't really control how many jobs are out there that I apply to and I don't hear back from. What I can control is how I navigate and regulate how I'm feeling internally and the people I surround myself with.
Could you talk a little bit more about internalizing accomplishments? I'm curious about that.
Yeah, a lot of times what will happen is people will write their resumes and say, here's all these accomplishments that I have, and then never revisit it. And part of navigating imposter syndrome and combating it is learning to internalize it and believe it. So part of imposter syndrome is having all these accomplishments, getting to a higher level in your career, and then saying, I don't belong here. So it's not being able to internalize that. That's really what's a core feature of imposter syndrome, of this phenomenon. So learning to internalize it. So that might be practicing it each day. It might then looking for additional data points, especially among my tech folks that are really data driven, who are really on their head. It can say, hey, let me look for data points. Let me look at my performance review and say, no, here's facts that I'm not an imposter, that this is real, that I did this accomplishment. So I can internalize this accomplishment and not just say it was luck. Okay, here's 4 different companies last time I was job searching who invited me for interviews based on my accomplishments. So finding data points, so you don't just say, here's an accomplishment, no, but no, that's mine, that I can
Mm.
own it as mine, is really important to combating imposter syndrome.
Yeah, I actually have a post about this coming out this week on imposter syndrome. And sometimes it's like, okay, is this imposter syndrome or is this actually just a skills gap?
Mhm.
And sometimes people will say, oh, I have imposter syndrome. And then I would say, well, no, you're a new leader. You're 2 months into the role. You just don't actually know how to be a leader yet. That's not
Yeah.
imposter syndrome. That's
Yeah.
actually skills development that you need to
Mhm.
work on. But the real imposter syndrome, which I do find more interesting, is exactly like you said, someone who has all of the credibility. And I'm
Mhm.
working with a client right now, an extremely accomplished client. And when we talk about their accomplishments, they get a kind of visceral reaction around it.
Mhm.
Like they don't believe that it's them who has done all of that. And I mean,
Mhm.
for them, I know we've spoken a bit about internal family systems therapy. That's the method that I go to
Mhm.
when I'm really working with imposter syndrome. And because what we do is we look at the part of them that doesn't believe it and we start to understand, okay, where is that part from coming from? Usually it's a part from childhood,
Mhm.
and a lot of times what I see is you've got these, 40 something, let's say 50-year-olds running multi-million dollar P&Ls, but really it's a little child running the show. And it's a little
Mhm.
child that's just looking for love, that's just looking for
Yep.
validation. That's then like that little part of them that's been abandoned that then is
Mhm.
acting out in these certain ways. So that's my favorite method to look at that, because it's usually very interesting, and sometimes it's like, "Oh, I didn't even know that my sister not wanting to play with me when I was younger was, like, impacting the way that I'm showing up in a boardroom."
Yeah, and they keep seeing these patterns come out over and over and over, and then realize, oh, there's something I can do about this, and I can, once I catch that loop, I can then intercept it and say, oh, I'm going to stop that and change it moving forward.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. And, I mean, I'm wondering, if you have, like, let's say redundancies are a
Mm.
really big thing right now, and someone has been out of work for a really long time. I mean, I know with what you said of like data driven, I just wonder if we could expand a little bit on like controlling the process
Mhm.
rather than looking at results, because sometimes I think that this can be like people do start to say, okay, it's me. I feel like I'm Taylor Swift. I'm like, I'm the problem. Um,
Mhm.
but when people are saying, "Okay, I'm trying, I'm doing it, but I think that there is something wrong with me." So I loved with what you were saying on, okay, let's just look at the process a little bit more.
Yeah, what I love doing is looking at the pipeline when I think of the process and saying, what's each step in the pipeline? One, at the very beginning of our conversation, values. What's important to me in a job or even in my career and my life? Is it work life balance? We could have a whole conversation, but we're going to summarize work life balance. We'll just use that phrase to make it easy. Work life balance. Maybe I'm working 30, 40, 50 hours a week. Maybe financial independence is important, starting there, and then saying, what do I need exactly in that next job, and finding jobs and positions aligned. That's kind of next in the pipeline. We have next finding jobs, companies, positions that align. We then have applying for jobs using your resume and LinkedIn. You could also have recruiters reaching out. And I like looking at each of those steps and saying, what's in my control? I can identify my values. I can reach out to recruiters. I can apply for jobs. I can update my LinkedIn. I can't control how many recruiters reach out. I can't control how many people reply to my resume. I can't control how many people reply if I network. But what's each metric I can control in this kind of pipeline. Okay, I'm going to apply to 3 jobs a day. I'm going to message 5 people a day. I'm going to update my LinkedIn, spend 30 minutes a week optimizing it. Here's each thing I can control, and let's see if the outputs then match my effort. And usually, if we spend time on the inputs, the outputs are then going to match it. And I encourage my clients, if the outputs aren't working, okay, great. That's an indicator that we then need to change the inputs.
Mm, mm. What are some inputs that you would change if the outputs aren't
Yeah,
working?
it could be the quantity. It could be, okay, some clients are like, I'm not hearing back, but they've only applied to 3 jobs. So it could be just increasing the number of jobs you apply to. Or it could be the quality. Let's say you've applied to 100 jobs and you haven't heard back from any. It could be changing the types of jobs you're applying to. One of my clients kept applying to manager jobs, and I was like, maybe this is too low. You're a director now. We have to actually apply to higher level jobs. It could be updating your resume or updating your LinkedIn, or if, let's say you're networking, you've contacted 50 people and no one's replied. It might be your message. It could just be that too. Like if you're getting a really low percentage response rate, it might not be that you haven't reached out to enough people. It could just be the message, the copy itself. And then if when you've been doing it a while, sometimes you just keep going because it's easier to just do that kind of grunt work to keep reaching out. And I encourage people, have someone else look at it and not just ChatGPT, because then you're going to blend in with everyone else. I think it can be used for helpful things. Can you reword
Mhm.
this bullet and help me? A lot of clients use it. But having someone who's an expert in this, looking at it and saying, hey, I've sent this message to 50 people, no one's replied. What's up? I've applied to 50 jobs, no one's replied. Why is that? Can really help you figure out what's going on once you know where in the pipeline you're stuck.
Mm.
A lot of people I work with, they might get stuck and say, my resume is not working, but they have 40 interviews. Your resume is working. Something's happening in that conversation where the dots aren't connecting.
Okay, so you're kind of saying, like, let's say someone's getting a lot of interviews, but then it's falling down. It's like, okay, let's hone in then on the interview process. If they're not even getting interviews,
Mhm.
then let's hone in on what is your messaging, what is the application process. So it's actually looking at. I mean, I was working with someone, a client I referred you to actually, or I referred to you, and it was getting a lot of interviews, but then the roles weren't landing. And then I realized, okay, that's when I referred out and was like, I think you need to work more with an executive coach on just interview prep. And same, I mean, that candidate, we can both say, like, I think wasn't really owning his story and his
Yep.
accomplishments. A highly accomplished person
Yep.
managed like billion-dollar P&Ls
Yep.
and wasn't actually attributing that to his work. So a lot of that was
Yeah.
like, okay, let's internalize these accomplishments so that you are standing out in an interview process.
And that's where I think the pipeline's helpful for people listening. I would draw out your pipeline. And even that's like one of the basic things. It's like the doctor. If you go to the doctor and say, oh, I want Tylenol, but you have a stomach ache, that's not really going to fix it. They might give you Pepto or something else. Like that's the first step, that diagnosis. So I would kind of look at your pipeline and say, where am I stuck? A lot of people come to me and say, I don't know what I want to do for a living, Kyle. Let's write a resume. Okay, that we have to start. So I would start there with your pipeline. Almost every first call I do with people is like looking at the pipeline. Where are we stuck can be really helpful.
Yeah. Well, I'm curious more about values because there are so many different ways to go through values. So let's say someone at the very beginning of this
Mhm.
journey. And also for anyone joining us on LinkedIn and Instagram, if you have questions, feel free to pop them in the comments. So we've got time at the end. But let's say someone like very at the kind of at the beginning. So they're just like, okay, I'm not clear. And you're like, right, let's do values. What's the there's so many different ways to do that. And I'm always like very curious about which ways other coaches do it.
Yeah, I love questions. So I just start there. What are your goals? What are your dreams? What are what do you want to achieve in life? Um, and then some people are like, I don't know what this means, Kyle. And then I'm like, okay, what are your values? What's important to you? Okay, let's say we're at your funeral. What do you want to have said about you? Or what do you want to, you're on your deathbed. What does that look like? So sometimes we'll get more specific, but usually just starting there, having a question or two to guide yourself can be a fun jumping off point. And then returning to that every 6 months or a year, saying, okay, what are my values? What are my goals? And then when my clients have a partner or partners, we'll often have them then with their homework go talk to them. Hey, is there anything missing here? Oh, I forgot. We said we want to travel 6 months out of the year. And that's important when you look for a job to say, hey, are they going to allow me to travel a lot? Is there a PTO policy? Are they flexible? and to know which companies to target.
Yeah. And I also do want to talk about compromise as well, because
Mhm,
sometimes, let's say I have a client, and one of his values was really freedom and travel. He's at a time in his life where he doesn't have a mortgage, he doesn't have children, and he was like, I actually want to travel around the world right now. And the role that he knew he wanted to change companies, and he wanted a fully remote role. And it
mhm,
was actually that he ended up taking a step down. He was in sales, and he ended up taking a step down in order to get that role. But that allowed him to work all over South America and Latin
mhm,
America. And so I also do want to talk about, like, I think that sometimes we think, okay, we want it all and we want exactly everything, but there are compromises. And especially, I mean, it's kind of different because I think that I work a lot with salespeople. I'm from sales. Salespeople's salaries are quite lucrative, quite young. And then typically when they don't want the pressure of a quota, or they want something that's a bit more aligned with their values. There are realities that, okay, maybe you don't want to work as much or be as stressed, but
mhm,
you might have to compromise something. You might have to
mhm,
make a lateral move. You might have to compromise a bit on
mhm.
salary. And I think that where people get stuck is they say, I don't want to compromise anything here, and I want every single thing. And I'm wondering just what your take on that is. If you say, okay, it actually is all possible, or if you actually do look at areas of compromise.
No, I often look at areas of compromise, and that first session with clients often start with saying, okay, what do you need in your next job? This is mandatory in my next job. This is the bare minimum. What's our wants? And then what are deal breakers, and getting clear on what bucket things are in. People say, oh, I need this in the next job. Okay, let's clarify. Is that a need or something you want? And really breaking that down before you job search. Because often what will happen is you'll get out there and say, oh my gosh, Amazon is hiring all of this. And then it's a 90-minute commute each way, and you said you want to be able to tuck your kids in to bed, or you want to pick them up from school. So starting with that. Sometimes there is the perfect job that comes along that offers everything, but before you job search, really getting in touch with your values and mapping that out can be helpful. I use the same thing when we were looking for a new place to lease when we moved to Southern California. Is like, okay, what do we need? And then what's a nice to have? Like, okay, we need like a parking spot. It would be nice to have a garage. And like getting really clear on that can be helpful. So then you're not like, oh my gosh, this is perfect, but there's no garage. And really just delineating that before you job search can be helpful, because there's often going to be trade offs or compromises. And unless
Mhm.
you work for yourself, and even then there's going to be trade offs. Like in the US, lots of healthcare that I have to pay for working for myself. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I think that, I really like that. Let's create the map even before, because sometimes what I see is like a bit of shiny object syndrome of like, oh, but Amazon has this, or oh, but Google has
mhm,
this. And I did actually just, one of my clients was looking at a promotion at her current company. And then she was like, but they're going to promote me. And it was a conversation of, yeah, but didn't you want to pick up your son every day at 4 p.m.? And this company isn't allowing that. Isn't that really important? Like, isn't like, let's go back to what's actually important to you during this time. And I think mapping that out before the job
mhm.
process is really crucial so people don't get that shiny object syndrome.
Exactly. Otherwise, you're just going to be making the parameters and be like, oh, this fits, this fits, this fits. Like, no, you want to make the recipe card before you start baking.
Yeah, yeah. Do you have any questions for me? I know that we do a lot of overlap in work, so I did want to give you that opportunity.
You mentioned it briefly. I'd love for the people who are unfamiliar, can you share a little bit more about internal family systems with us and how that can support people in their careers?
Yeah, definitely. This is my favorite method. It's a method founded by Dr. Richard Schwartz, and I use it. I see an internal family systems therapist as well. I use it in my coaching practice, but it basically is a method where it looks at us. It's based on systems theory, but it looks at all of us as parts. So you could have a part that's very confident. You could have a part that experiences. I work with a lot of people who have really strong people pleasing
Mhm,
parts, strong imposter syndrome parts. And what we do is, let's say there's a people pleasing part, you actually look at that part as it's a person, and it
mm,
has its own fears, it has its own hopes, and it's been forced into that role for some reason. So you actually just interact with that part, and you can ask it questions. And what people usually realize is the part is trying to protect you in some way. It's trying to
Mm.
protect a vulnerable part, but it's maladaptive. So in doing this work, it's called unburdening, and you can actually get it to not behave, but get it to stop being so extreme. So clients that have really strong anger parts, procrastination parts, we can resolve that, and typically quite quickly in 2 or 3 sessions, parts that have been plaguing them their whole lives. It's a way to get right to your subconscious like nothing I've ever seen. It's an absolutely incredible method. I use it. So if you're curious more about that, send me a DM. But we did just get a question of how do we know what level we're at and whether we are an independent or individual contributor, manager, director, etc. Do you want to?
Yes. Hi, Trevia. Thank you for joining us. This is such a challenging topic, especially in tech, since roles can vary so much. I had one client go from a senior director role to a senior manager role and triple his salary and oversight.
Mm.
So it can be so interesting depending on company from company. What I often like doing, at least one of the ways to tell, is going at the job posting and seeing the levels of responsibility. What is this role doing? Years of experience not as helpful. I mean, it can be somewhat helpful, but not totally, since some companies are way off, especially startups. They're like, we want someone with 10 years of experience to be this IC entry level role. But often the responsibilities can give you some sort of idea. The other website I love is levels.fyi. If you've never went there, you can look for specific roles and compare them across companies. So you can say, okay, a product manager here is equal to a director of product here, and it has a bunch of different companies in different functional areas. It's levels.fyi, and you can go and see how roles compare across companies. And then what I also love is it's constantly getting data fed in, and people are sharing their job offers. So you can see what roles have what salary levels as well. So that's a good one to be able to tell what level. Another one I like is Blind. If you go into Blind, it's an anonymous job board where people have to be verified to share. So you can go on there and people can tell you at Amazon versus Google versus Meta, different companies that can give you an idea of what levels look like as well, since they can vary so much. Like in finance, someone can be a VP and be an entry level role and then go somewhere else and be a manager with 800 people reporting up into them.
Yeah, it's very thank you for that. That was a great summary, but it can be very interesting, and especially size of company, changing industry. It is quite it is so varied from company to company what one person is, an inflated title, taking a step down, getting a salary increase. So it is kind of quite, and I think what I see is people get really caught on the title and how it looks and how it appears to others. I just did a coaching session on this. So it is interesting. I work more on the internal part of saying, okay, like what does a higher title mean to you? Is it about salary, or is it about appearing impressive, or is it about you know, making your dad feel proud and you think that that's going to be the key to unlocking his love? Like, I think that then we could get kind of granular in it, but curious. And if you're kind of stuck on that, I would say like, why does this matter? Trying to figure that out.
Mhm.
Um, well, we are at time. And where can people find you if they want to know more about you, or how can people work with you?
Yes, of course. LinkedIn, of course, is one of the best places. Kyle Elliot with 2 L's and 2 T's. And then my website, caffeinatedkyle.com. You're welcome to reach out. You can schedule a consultation. They're always free to learn more and see if we're the best fit.
Great. Thank you so much. And for anyone curious about me and my services, hannahkissel.com. And my signature program, the Life and Work Transformation, I am opening it up soon. There's an early bird offer right now, but it really goes into all this. So if you're seeking a change in your career, you want to figure out what your ideal life is, you want to overcome imposter syndrome, you want to overcome feelings of self-doubt, you want to step into confidence and clarity and empowerment, that is a program designed to do all of it. And it's all underpinned with internal family systems therapy. So that part's work, I bring a lot of that into that program. So it's a very broad program, but it also gets pretty fucking deep. So you can send me a DM about that. And Kyle, thank you so much. It was so lovely to speak to you and hear your expertise. And I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you for having me. And thank you, everyone, for attending.